Next keynote is Bram Moolenaar. He is the creator and maintainer of Vim, a popular text editor. It comes installed with every Mac and Linux computer and is available for almost every computer system. After studying electronic and inventing parts of digital copying machine, Bram decided that creating open source software was more useful and fun. So he worked on that exclusively for several years. He currently works for Google, one of the few companies that embrace open source software. In between, he did volunteer work at a project in, in Uganda and is still helping poor children there through the ICCF Foundation. Presentation title is Vim from hjkl to a platform for plugins. Please start.
Thank you. First of all, I'm honored to be here, to be invited to do the keynote. And I'm so happy to see all of you sitting here. Actually had to buy a ticket to be here, so that really means something to me. And I was in doubt, like, what should I talk about? Some history. I already did history talk a couple of years ago when Vim became 25 years old. And the organizers asked me to do something, to talk about something that basically nobody else would be able to talk about. So I hope I found something that will be interesting for you. So there's some history, there's some looking to the future, and well, you'll see what else there is. So when you look at Vim, several books have been written. And the first books basically just explained how to use Vim, what commands there were, what features it had, what keys to hit to get things done. These days, the next book is about how do you install plugins and how to use them. So that's quite a difference from where we started. These days, it's not so much about the individual commands, it's a whole platform that provides the features for plugins. So you can build plugins on top of Vim. Actually, the author of the book, Ruslan, he is also here. So you may want to say hello to him. Why don't you stand up, say hello? Yeah, so I think the book will be available in a few weeks. So where did we start? This is actually a nice picture to indicate the environment where VI was created. So this is a PDP-11, and those are huge boxes, but they actually can't do much. They're very slow and only have a little bit of memory. So the first features in VI were limited, but still quite powerful. So you had some settings and a startup file or XRC file. Undo was there, but it's only one level. You go back one step and then forward again. There was actually a swap file, not so much because it's such a nice thing to have, but the memory was so limited, so to be able to work on larger text, you needed a swap file. And you could put things in a register and execute it. And there were mappings. And actually, these mappings could be used very powerful because you could make them recursive. So while executing a mapping, it will trigger another mapping. And some people found you can do some really clever things with it, like solving a maze. So I'm not going to explain how it works because it's quite complicated, but it basically comes down to being a state machine where you're in a certain state, you look at the cursor position, what the character is next to the cursor, and from there you go to the next state. And this is all done with mappings. So VI was already able to do that. But you can, imagine that it's quite complicated to write a plugin with something like that. There were some other features that were useful at the time. There were mode lines, but you could basically execute any command. So that's a big security gap. So you would load a file, it would do anything that's in the mode line. And you could source another file. That was there from the beginning, and that's actually a very powerful part because plugins are in a file. So that part existed. But lots of things were not in VI. So if statements, there was only one window, one buffer. Highlighting wasn't there, even error messages were not highlighted. There was no completion, no make command. You could use the exclamation mark to execute a shell command, but that was about it. Well, obviously lots of other things were missing. And the main reason is not because nobody wanted them, but that big box just couldn't handle much more. If you look at the old VI source code, you will find that a lot of the variable names are just one letter. And that is because the compiler would run out of memory just building VI. So, when I started working on Vim, I wanted to make it better, improve it. That's also in the name, of course. There were a lot of features that were added over time. I will just pick out a few that are still useful, especially for plugins. Auto commands. This was one of the first things that was a quite convenient feature, and it was added in Vim 4, so it's quite early. And these days it's still used an awful lot by plugins. What it does basically is you can define a hook that triggers at a certain point, so that's the auto command event. And in this case, buff read is the event. And you give a pattern, so when does it match? In this case, with the file names, it's reading a file. And then you can execute any command. So that's quite powerful. And if you look at the flow of the code, so there's a C function buff write that actually writes the file, the buffer into a file. There's two places where you can hook into it before the write actually happens, so you can change the buffer before it's written. I myself use it quite often to add a date stamp to the file before you write it. And you can do something after the buffer was written, like cleaning it up. Now there's one big problem with this, is that these auto commands can do anything. So for example, after you've written a buffer, you say, well, I don't need it any longer, so let's wipe it out. But then the buff write function was keeping a pointer to that buffer. And once you've executed the auto commands, that pointer is no longer valid. So if you try to access something there, crash. Oops, that's really a crash. So there's many places where auto commands are used where this was a problem, and a lot of bugs were fixed around that, and there's probably some more. So what are the ways we use to avoid problems with auto commands? Well, first of all, just check if a pointer is still valid. So in the source code, there's actually a function that says, is this pointer actually a valid buffer pointer? And so you can check if the pointer is still valid. Another way is to say, well, in this auto command block, I do not want this buffer to be deleted or touched. And so there's a flag that says this buffer is locked, so you cannot wipe it out. This is especially used in places where you are going to delete a buffer. And then you say, well, no auto command should touch this. There's a third way that currently isn't used, I believe. But it's another solution that when you actually wipe out the buffer, it would not delete the structure, but it would put it aside to be deleted later when the reference count goes to 0. This is a bit of a complicated way of doing things, but it's like a modern way. It's like garbage collection. For any of these solutions, of the 3 solutions, you still have to be aware that the buffer was deleted. So if you do something with the current buffer, then if the buffer is deleted, it means something else is now the current buffer. So you still have to be careful not to make changes to the wrong buffer. So it's actually quite complicated. All right, another big step that happened is the introduction of what I would call vim script, which is when the if command was introduced. And of course, if you have an if command, you also need expressions. The syntax for that was, at the time, very limited, because the idea was just, just need an if and a while loop, and that's about it. There were some types, so numbers and strings were supported, that's about it. And at some point, user functions were added. This was already quite powerful, but probably not nearly enough for writing plugins. I did, from the start, use garbage collection or automatic memory management. So you still profit from that today, that you don't have to worry about cleaning up your lists and structures and everything. They will be deleted automatically. At first, vim script was used for things like syntax highlighting, and you could use the if statement like, if I'm Unix, do this, if I'm on Windows, do that. And later, only later, file type plugins were added, and indent plugins. The main problem at this point in time was that you could use these powerful features, but to be able to use them, you would have to edit your vimrc file and load the right file or whatever you were doing. You would, copy paste the code around, and that's quite inconvenient. So that's where plugins actually started, and that is in Vim 6. So it's not actually that long ago, but it's a clear point in time where Vim started to become a platform. So basically, what is a plugin? It means you can take a file, drop it in the right place, and Vim will load it when starting up. And it's a very simple principle, but it's what the whole plugin system is built on top of. Of course, there's not just one directory, but we actually have the runtime path. I actually forgot when exactly this was introduced, but I think it was quite early. So you could actually look in different directories, your personal one, the system one, maybe another one, where plugins could exist. And only much later, when plugin managers appeared, they kept adding more and more and more directories to the runtime path. So now it can actually grow really long. A few plugins were distributed with Vim. The net read-write plugin is one of the most used ones. I use it myself to even, if somebody sends a pull request, I can actually just edit the diff file and see it in Vim. So that's very convenient. You don't have to go to a browser to do that. The RR helper and Explorer are both gone by now because they're taken over by something else. And the gzip plugin I actually wrote myself, so you can edit a zip file and a compressed file. So after the start of plugins, a lot of new features were added to support plugin writers. Lists, dictionaries, those are basic data structures. The idea mostly comes from Python. Float was added at some point. For a long time, I thought, like, it's a text editor. Who needs floating point numbers in a text editor? But it turns out there were several people that said, yeah, I really need a float number. So, okay, let's add it. Yeah, that's how it works. Basically, I try to hold back on new features because otherwise it will just blow out of proportion. But if enough people say, well, I really need it, okay, then we'll add it. The function reference and lambda that was also mentioned before, I would also call it partial because you can actually include some data with the function reference. And job and channel, of course, were added when those features were added. So those are the types of variables and data that you can use. And so the blob or blob type, as I would call it, is maybe going to be added. We'll have to talk about that. And let's see when that patch comes and see if there's enough justification to add that type. I'm really trying to only add the things that are really useful for a larger group of users, because it's very dangerous to just add any patch, because then the code will become unmaintainable. Yeah, things were growing over the years. So in different versions, more and more functions were added, and I think that's a good indication of the capabilities that were available to plugin writers. Especially at the start, it grew quite quickly. And these days, we don't add that many functions anymore, but they keep coming. Now, the more plugins you write, the more the performance becomes a problem. You like to start Vim and it's there immediately. You don't want to wait for the startup process. And if you hit a key, you want it to take effect immediately and not wait for some plugin to churn away on some data. It's not always working fast enough. So there's some built-in features you can use to at least find out where Vim is spending its time. So the profile function is very useful to pin down hotspots, so find out where the plugin is wasting its time. And quite often there's a simple solution by replacing some lines, or you find a loop that doesn't need to be a loop. You can just do it in another way. So these are very useful things for plugin writers. Another thing is if you start Vim and it takes seconds, then there must be something that's wasting time. So the startup time command line flag is very useful to see exactly where the time is spent. I'm sure I've used it many times and find some plugin that I didn't even use was taking too long in startup. So how do you make them faster? Well, we have to separate two things. First of all, loading the plugin. So you're not doing anything yet. You're starting Vim, it loads the plugins. That can be slow, so how can we make that part faster? And the other part is when you're actually executing the functionality of the plugin. That can also be a bit slow, so how do we make that part faster? Well, for both things, you just get a faster computer. Yeah, it's really easy. You just go to a shop, buy it, and that's it. No work. I don't have to do anything, and that's the best solution. Unfortunately, computers don't get faster that much anymore, so we probably have to do something else as well. If you look at the plugin loading time, there's one very, very important feature that every plugin writer should use, which is the auto-load mechanism. So your plugin should actually only define some commands or mappings or the basic things you need to trigger the plugin, but the actual functionality should be under auto-load. So the moment the plugin actually starts doing something, Vim will see the auto-load name, and we will find the right script in the auto-load directory somewhere. This is a very useful, very powerful mechanism. It's been there for a long time, and I think not enough people know about it and use it. The netrw plugin is actually a very good example that the basic things that the plugin loads at startup is only like 10 kilobytes. So it defines some commands, some hooks, and some auto commands, and that's about it. And only the moment you actually start using it, that's when it loads the core of the plugin, and that's 0.5 MB, that's quite a lot. There's even one trick that I found people are using, is that if you want a plugin to be just one file, that you can just get from the internet and drop in the auto-load directory, that actually works. So the Vim plugin manager has this mechanism where you just get that one file and you trigger it by calling a function. So you put this function called plug begin in your vimrc, and that triggers loading the rest. So I think that's a very simple mechanism, and it appears to work well. Of course, this only works if you do something like this that calls the function by the autoload name. So you have this plug hash that triggers the autoload. It's not so convenient for user commands because you can't have the hash in there. Another thing that's very useful to speed up loading plugins is to split it into pieces, because quite often a plugin doesn't have to be loaded completely. There might be like a part for Unix and a part for Windows, or there might be a part for limited functionality and a part for other functionality, or it depends on what language you're using. So you can split up your plugin in different pieces and only load it when you really need it. So that was for loading the plugin, but there's always some lines of code you need to load, and Vim has to parse the lines before it can be executed. So how do you improve that part? That's actually quite difficult. The parsing of commands is very complex. The syntax of commands is not uniform. Every command has a twist in how it's written and what the arguments are, and if you can have line numbers or count or anything else. So the parsing is actually quite complex. The best way to find out why parsing is slow is just to get a big script, run it, and then look at the profiling information to see where in the C code it spends most of its time. I've done this several times in the past, and sometimes you find some hotspots, but by now it's actually quite difficult to find a place in the code where it's spending a lot of time. It's spread out over large parts of functions. But still, there can be a regression, and we can use profiling to find some things that can be improved. Another way that has been suggested is to load a plugin in a separate thread. So while the main thread is doing its thing, you would load the plugin in the background, basically, in a thread, and it would not slow down the main thread. Well, hopefully you have a processor with multiple cores, and then that would work. This is not easy to implement. It's very easy to get into race conditions and even deadlocks if you're using multi-threading. So the basic mechanism will be that the plugin would need to be loaded in a separate namespace or a separate environment, not interfering with the global namespace. And only once it's done, you would make it available in the global namespace. Probably an auto-load mechanism, sort of, would work. I've actually not tried to implement this, and I've also not seen anybody else sending a patch for this. But it's one thing that would be possible, but it's a bit hard to get right and make sure that nothing breaks. But if it works, it would help a lot. So, someday. Another thing that happens if you talk about plugin performance and people complain that VimScript is so slow, then they suggest, well, why don't we use another language, like, Python, Perl, whatever? Because these languages have already been implemented and optimized, and those are much faster. So if you look at what's available right now, so we have some interfaces for Python, Perl, Ruby, Lua. They all exist, and they're there. But how many plugin writers actually use them? It's not much, unfortunately. There are a few, and especially Python seems to be the most popular. That's no surprise because Python is the most popular scripting language in the world, if you forget about JavaScript. The problem is mainly that plugin authors, first of all, they need to know the language, so you also need to know Python. You still need to write Vim script, of course, so it's an extra language you need to learn and understand. And then you have the problem, it might not work everywhere. Not every Vim has Python built in. And on Windows, you have the problem that the Python support has to be there, and it has to be installed. It's getting better now that we have a big Vim installer that includes just about everything. But still, it's not everywhere. So, not so many plugin writers actually use these languages. And you might argue that the way you use them, so the API that's available is not very good, so it could be improved, and yeah, that's true. You could make the Python interface better, but it has already been worked on quite a bit. Nikolai Pavlov has improved this quite a bit, and even he himself, I don't think he's using it now. So I think we have to realize, I mean, we tried to use these languages and use them, but we have to realize that it's not really working well. So I think it's better to forget about that and put our energy in making Vim script better and faster. So let's not do that. Okay, so back to making Vim script faster. How do we do that? I think there's still a lot of things we can win. First of all, if you define a function, every time the function is executed, it will parse those lines over and over again. So instead of doing that, you could parse every line, it's just text from the start, and sort of half compile it into something that doesn't need to be parsed again. And then that intermediate form can be executed over and over again. So you would parse the text line, put it in an intermediate form, and then later when you execute the function, you execute the intermediate form. That should be a lot faster. In theory, you could also take that intermediate form and store it in a file. So you would sort of compile your Vim script, you would compile your plugin into a compiled plugin. It's possible, but let's keep that for later. So how would that work? I have given this a bit of thought, but nothing of this has been implemented yet. So you would take the line, you would parse the things that you know are there, like the line range, the command name, and maybe you can parse some of the arguments. It depends on the command, really. If there's an if statement, you could parse the expression and turn the expression in some kind of bytecode. This works in several places, and other places it doesn't work. So the best way to do this is to just start with the text, parse the things you know, add them to the structure that's used to execute it later, and gradually add more and more to it, depending on what turns out to be faster. That's going to be a lot of work. I do think it will help. It will make executing scripts a lot faster, but at the same time, it will take a lot of time and effort to implement. But it's something that we could do. Okay, work in progress. All right. And when you talk about plugins, you probably just want to get them, drop them somewhere, and forget about it, and just happily use them. But it's not that easy. The original mechanism was you get the file from somewhere, you drop it in the plugin directory, and then every time there's an update, you have to repeat that. Some plugins are coming in multiple files, so you have to drop different files in different places. And if you make an update, you have to repeat that, and hopefully the files can just be overwritten, because if some file was renamed or it disappeared, you have to remember to actually delete it. That gets complex. So first of all, what I did in Vim 8 was to add package management. Very primitive way, but the main thing it does is make sure that every plugin is in its own directory. So now you can just sync something from GitHub, and you don't have to manually put files in the right position. Every time there's an update, you can just do git pull, and it will get there. So you don't have to worry about it. Of course, you still have to do git pull. And if it's an archive, if you download some plugins that are coming in a zip archive or any other form, you can just unpack them. And if you want to install an update, you just delete what you had and unpack the new archive. So that helps a bit, but it's still some manual work. So of course, there are plugin managers. And there's several of them. One better than the other. Some are well maintained, some are new, some are old. I actually, when I was working on Vim 8, I asked people, what is the plugin manager so we can include it with Vim? The problem was there was not really one that stood out that everybody could use. So unfortunately, that doesn't exist. So we are still in a situation that you can pick your own plugin manager, and other people use other plugin managers. If you look at what they're doing, most of them these days are using GitHub. So they sync with GitHub to get the latest version, which is not without risk. It would usually work, but somebody could rename his project, and it suddenly stops working. Somebody could actually delete his project. This has happened before. And things will just stop working. And what about GitHub itself? I mean, it's a commercial platform. At some point, they may say, well, we're going to ask money for it. Or they may just shut down. I mean, there's other platforms that have disappeared in the past, or like SourceForge that we used with Vim a lot, has become very unreliable. So these things may actually happen in the future. Another thing with plugin managers is defining dependencies. There still is no good way of saying this plugin needs that plugin. And the Vim plugin author actually complained about this. He tried to build something, but it just didn't catch on, so it never got any traction. But I think it's still a good idea if we define a way to do this. It's just a good way that instead of having one bulky plugin, you have a smaller plugin that depends on other plugins that provide functionality. Another problem is versioning. So over time, a plugin may develop, add features, rename things, and it becomes incompatible. So the brute force way of doing this is that one plugin, some high-level plugin that depends on other ones, would just include that one in the project. If you're using Git and GitHub, it's actually not that difficult to just pull a new version and include it in your plugin and then publish your plugin. That also makes sure that any versioning problems will be taken care of. You just get one big plugin that's a combination of several plugins. That works, but there's one remaining problem, is that if you include a plugin in one plugin and you have the same plugin also included in another one, then the namespaces will clash. And there may actually be a different version, so that becomes a problem. So I have a proposal how we're going to solve this. And hopefully there will be discussion later about how well this works. First of all, a plugin that you install needs to declare its dependencies. And we can just pick one file name, and I'm proposing dependencies.vim, which is very obvious. And it contains calls to plugin depend. And this function would basically declare the dependencies, and then there's another function that says load the dependencies. So there's the declaration of the dependency and actually loading the dependency. It could look something like this. This is just an idea. So you could depend on some plugin. And the first one gets it from GitHub, and you only need the project name then. And the second one is an example where it's just a zip file that exists somewhere. And that's actually convenient, so you can get them from the Vim script database. The result of the plugin depend function is stored in a variable, and that variable you can later use in the plugin depend function. Sorry, that's the other one. Yeah, this is the one I mean. So the plugin load actually loads the plugin. So you separate the declaration. So the plugin manager will look at the dependencies and prepare getting them, or you can update to the latest version. And then depending on what you're doing, you can either load them all at the same time, or you can load them when you need them. So the advantage is that you can only load the parts that you need. So it may be that you actually depend on like 5 different plugins, but at some point in time you only need 1 or 2 of them. So we still have the problem with incompatible changes. So if a plugin changes over time and there's different versions, I'm proposing to just give them a different name. So just add a version number or anything. And that's the easiest way to do this. Of course, there's much more complex ways to dealing with versioning, but just using a different name is a simple and I think good enough way of doing this. So in case the plugin load doesn't work, you could actually have a backup mechanism for that if you really want to. Like I say, this is a proposal, it's an idea, and I hope we can have a discussion about whether this will actually work. I don't know if there's any people here working on a plugin manager, but I would especially like to hear from them if this will work for them. And I think users will really like this. All right, I have to speed up a little bit because I'm running out of time. I would actually like to include the plugin manager with Vim, but we can only do that if there's one that everybody wants to use. So, okay. So I actually like to support plugin authors. The question is how? What do plugin authors actually want? And what's also important, what's not too much work to implement, because otherwise we'll not make much progress. If you look around, is that people ask for just anything. Of course, the job channel thing was one thing that stood out and got included in Vim 8. But they ask for just any little thing. And for me, it's very hard to say if it's something that a lot of people want, or maybe there's just one person that will actually want to use it. So I have to be careful about what to include next. And find a common, a generic solution. So Vim 8, jobs and channels, got added. It was at the point in time very clear that that's what plugin writers needed. So I added that. Also, I was wondering, like, how do people writing plugins actually test their stuff? Well, since in Vim 8 also the assert functions got added, those are also available for plugin authors, and there's bits and pieces of things you can use for tests, like the feed keys function, and I also added the possibility to do screenshot tests, which is actually very useful for things like completion and anything that has to do with highlighting. So if you write plugins, please have a look at how these screenshot tests work. There's some examples for them. It may be a bit tricky at first, but once you get the hang of it, it's actually very convenient. And especially if something breaks, you can very quickly see what the problem is. So what else? What do plugin authors actually want? Well, I didn't know, so I started a poll. And this is the result from about a week ago, a bit longer. And I counted not just individual requests, but bundled them together a little bit that are going to be implemented together. And it's actually surprising to see that a lot of people want some kind of pop-up window, either for completion or to show messages or for other things, that they just want to show some text with color somewhere in the window. Another thing is to store text properties. So currently we have syntax highlighting, but that's all dynamic. So the output of the highlighting is never stored. It's always generated the moment you refresh your screen. And a lot of people say, well, we actually want to store that information with the text. Faster Vim support, well, that's actually something we already talked about, and there's a long list of other things. But let's first go into the first two. And the interesting thing is that the pop-up window, you need to have some way to define what to show there, including highlighting. And the second one, text properties, also is used to define highlighting. So those two are actually related to each other, or actually the pop-up window depends on the text properties. So let's look at that one first. The basic idea is that you take some text with a start point, a length, or an end point, and you say this property applies to that text. And when you insert text, when you delete lines, insert characters, then that property would move along with the text. I think it's also important to make it possible to nest them. Just like with syntax highlighting, you can have certain areas inside other areas. So you can define this is a function, and inside a function you can say this is a command. You need some specific flags to define what happens if you insert text just before or just after that area. And this is some way to illustrate it. So you could say function, you attach the property statement, and some type or other type, you attach the property type. And that's how it would work. Now, every text property, I think, should have a unique ID. So you can always find it. And if you're using some parser or some highlighter or another mechanism, you can find the thing that you found before and relate it to the next thing you're going to do. So a unique ID is just to be able to retrieve every single property. And then there's a property type where you can say, this is this kind of property. And that would be mostly used for highlighting. So one goal or one check for the feature would be that you would have an asynchronous highlighter. So you would take the text, give it to some external program. You don't know how long it will take, but at some point it will come back with the highlighting information, and then that should be turned into text properties. You can attach it to the text. We need quite a bit of stuff to make this work. So we need some functions to add a property, remove it, find it back, clear properties. You need a way like if you change text, you have a callback to say, hey, this text changed, so you may want to update your text properties there. There's quite a bit of functionality that we need. How do we implement this? That's actually quite tricky because so far Vim just dealt with text, lines of text. And now suddenly we want to attach basically binary data with pieces of text. And you have to keep in mind that text can be really big. Like some people even added a log file of 1 gigabyte, and it should still work. Well, I thought about this, and probably the best way is to say Vim is very much based on lines of text. So you can take a text line, and then there's a null byte to signify the end of the text. And we can put something after it. So it's still one line, but you first have the text, a null byte, and then some more information which contains the text properties. Well, what are those properties? What do we actually need to store? The point where it starts, so the starting column, or byte probably, the length or the end. Like I said, the unique ID and the property type. And we need some flags that say, like, if a property goes over a line break, so it continues in the next line, you would set a flag continues from previous line, things like that. This would actually not cost much space. I think one property is about 20 bytes. Unless you use a 64-bit system, it would be double that. Now, a large part of the implementation would look into making changes. So we have to make sure that whenever you insert something or delete something, those text properties are also updated. So that's going to be quite a bit of work to make it work correctly. And then if you actually change some text, you want to call back to tell your plugin to say, hey, this text changed. You probably want to check the syntax. Also, I think we have to limit the functionality somehow. If you copy text and put it in a register, do we still need those text properties? I think we don't. So text properties would only live in the buffer itself, but as soon as you take the text, it's just text. So if you do getLine or setLine, it would not include those properties. So once this has been implemented, so that may take some time, once that has been implemented, we can actually use the same mechanisms for a pop-up window. So this is a synthetic example of how this could work. So you would say, I want this message to appear at this position on the screen, and it needs to contain this text with these text properties. And then hopefully it shows up in nice colors. The question is, would we support multiple windows, pop-up windows? I think we should. A very good example, this here, yeah. So for example, if you're doing completion, you would show some extra information about what you're completing. And at the same time, some background task may be finished and throw up a message like, hey, I'm done, and the build process succeeded. And that would be completely asynchronous. So we need multiple windows for that. We could also use this to have a more a nicer way of asking the user a choice. Currently, we have the confirm function, but it's very simplistic. In the GUI, it looks a bit nicer, but in the text version, it's very primitive. So we can actually use the pop-up window to actually make this look better. But that's optional, we can do that later. All right, so there's lots of other things that people have asked for. There's, even below the last line, there's several where like only 10 people said that's a good idea. I'm not saying that we're not going to do that. Some of them may actually be really easy to implement, so we can just do that, even though not that many people asked for it. And some of these that have been voted for are actually quite a lot of work, so not sure when they will get done. Work in progress. All right, I think I've done it in quite a good time, so we still have some time for questions. How much time do we have left? Like 5 minutes or so?
6 minutes.
6 minutes, okay. Very precise.
質問は日本語でも大丈夫です。こちらに来てください。Questions can be either in Japanese or English. Please come here to ask a question.
Thank you for presentation. So you are determining the next feature from the poll. So honestly, what is the most favorite feature for you?
For me,
Yeah.
So if I look at, where is it? This list. I actually agree that the text property thing is probably one of the most important things to add. We have syntax highlighting, and it has worked pretty well for simple cases. But if the syntax gets complex, it can get very, very slow. A good example is XML. The XML syntax highlighter quite often runs into a timeout, and quite often it's like just one long line. So if we could use an external parser and then tell Vim how to highlight, and every time you refresh the screen, it doesn't have to do that again because the text properties are there. So it can just use the highlighting from that and doesn't have to do the parsing all over again. So I think that will actually make a very big impact. And once this has been implemented, I think many plugins will pop up that will use this feature. And so it matches the voting with my own idea. So I think that's a good thing. I was flying here, and it's a very long flight, so I actually started looking at how to implement this. And I think it's very doable. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, very, very nice. And I'm sorry, one more question. So what do you think about the language server protocol?
Which protocol?
Language server, LSP.
I don't know it.
Oh, I
The
see.
LSP protocol has come up in the poll, and before this, I actually had not heard of it. I think there's actually a connection to the text properties, because if you have some server that understands the language, the plugin can probably talk to it and update the text properties, but also for completion and lots of other stuff. So it sounds important, but because I don't know what it means,
I see.
and also I don't know how plugins currently use it. So do we actually need native support in Vim? Or can we say, well, a plugin can do it based on existing functionality? I'm afraid I don't know it well enough to give an answer right now. So I hope that people who actually want to use LSP can tell me what they actually need. And maybe it's just some pieces of functionality and not implementing the whole protocol.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the answers.
Hi. First, this is my first VimConf, so I want to thank you to event organizer and my company Kuiper for providing this very, very inspiring experience. Arigatou gozaimashita. Sorry, I can't really speak Japanese. I have two questions. First, what's in the future for Vim and NeoVim? I see it. We both, as Vim community, want to improve Vim, and on the other hand, NeoVim also want to improve Vim. So basically, we have same purpose, but different tracks maybe. So what's going to happen in the future? And my second question is, I always want to ask you directly, as Vim dictator, nice dictator, with my respect, what's going to happen in the future? Is there will be another contributor or something like that in the future or in the near future? Thank you very much.
Yeah, NeoVim has been developing various things, and I don't really keep an eye on it much because there's already so many things that keep me busy. So if somebody points to me like, hey, NeoVim has this nice feature, maybe we should add it to Vim, then there's a few problems. First of all, NeoVim has completely refactored the code, so any patch that works for NeoVim would have to be redone completely to be able to apply it to Vim. So I really have to depend on everybody out there to do this, because for me it just takes too much time. Also for testing, NeoVim is using Lua with some Lua library for testing, and in Vim we don't have that, and I don't really plan to add it. But I'm quite sure that in NeoVim you can also write tests using the Vim assert functions and other things. So if you do it that way, then we can actually share those tests instead of having to rewrite them when you move them over. So that would help. Otherwise, we'll just see. I mean, I don't really have a plan for exactly when what is going to happen. I just look at it and say, okay, let me do this. And somebody sends a nice patch and I say, oh, that's a nice patch, let me include that. And that's not planned or anything. So it depends very much on the quality of the patch and whether I think many people will profit from it. Will there be another contributor? Actually, I've been looking for other people to help out. But still haven't found one that's both capable of doing it and willing to do it. So that's quite difficult. Fortunately, since we now have the pull request on GitHub, people can create a pull request, it will run some automatic tests, and other people can comment on it. So that helps me a lot that the patch, the pull request, is already seen by quite a few people, and make it easier for me to decide if I should include it or not. And so please, if you see some patch flying by on GitHub, please look at it and give your comments and tell if, like, this is wrong because there's a better solution, or hey, this is great, but can you just change the comment or add documentation or add a test? That's very helpful so that I don't have to spend much time on it.
Okay. Thank you very much.
はい、では時間を越しているので最後に短い質問をします。ブラムさん、質問です。この会場にいるみんなに何か、今日希望するものはありますか？ My question, I require a very short answer. What do you expect these Vim users, Vim developers today?
What do I expect for Vim users? Just enjoy. I spend a lot of time in Vim, and a lot of people help me creating Vim. And so it gives me great pleasure to see people using it and being happy with it. I know there's a big silent group of people that I never hear from, but are just happily using Vim and don't run into any bugs or problems. And quite often a lot of discussions go on about little things that are not quite right, but hopefully the rest is good. And I'm also very happy that there's so many people here today, and the organizers have done a great job of getting you here, and we have a nice program today. So yeah, that also makes me happy. So if you're happy, I'm happy.
Thank you. I'm happy.
Thank you for your presentation.